Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Earthly Delights podcast. This week we have Saoirse McHugh. Saoirse is a Mayo native and environmentalist, and someone who deeply cares about the future of Ireland. Um, she was kind enough to give us an hour of her time not too long ago, and it was a pleasure getting to ask her some of the questions I've been wanting to ask her for quite a long time. We touch on de-stigmatising unemployment, the root causes of the tone deaf policies we've been seeing quite recently, Saoirse's departure from the Green Party, and what Saoirse's utopia looks like in 5 years, and more. um, Thanks for listening, guys, and hope you enjoy. All the best. Saoirse McHugh, welcome to the Earthly Delights podcast. Thanks for giving us your time.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. First of all, what's the crack? How have you been keeping?
Good now. I suppose the crack has been fairly similar for most people, and like a lot of people, I'm looking for a job at the moment, and wondering, will I be left in my house? Will I have a house there and over the next 6 months or so?
Yeah.
So it's definitely exciting. Anyway.
Yeah, it's funny because like it's always been uncertain, but now it's the uncertainty is definitely just amplified, and I feel everybody is just more aware of the uncertainty than ever.
Yeah, and maybe it's not a real thing, but it does feel like, before I've been unemployed several times in my life. Before the pandemic, I had internalized maybe a lot of the shame of being unemployed. But now I feel that maybe a lot more people, maybe for the first time ever, are, in a precarious condition, and it seems that there's a lot more maybe solidarity with people. And I don't feel shame saying, I'm actually unemployed and finding it really hard to get work, because so many people are like that at the moment.
Yes, absolutely.
Which isn't necessarily a good thing, but it's nice to not feel like the only one.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely regard it as progress. I remember maybe it was like 6 or 7 months ago. I also applied for the dole, and it was so I had a few experience where I was unemployed, but for maybe a month or so, and I always didn't want to apply for it just because I thought, oh no, I mean, I'd prefer not to, and
yeah,
like I felt that kind of people will say this, oh, he's on the dole, but I eventually did it just before the COVID, and then obviously the COVID thing happened. But yeah, it's strange. Like you say, it's not a positive thing, but I can't see it any other way, in that it's kind of like an understanding that this could happen to anyone, really.
Yeah,
it's not a reflection on you as a person at all, or your productivity, or this kind of thing.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting how the government have modified the PUP payment now, so that the amount of money you get depends on how much you were earning beforehand. Do you remember everyone was getting, if you had lost your job due to COVID in the beginning, you're getting $350 a week.
Yes.
But they introduced, or they are introducing then different levels, where if you were earning above a certain amount, you get $350. If you're earning below a certain amount, you get, I think it's $3, and then $2, or $250 and $2. And I just think that's really interesting, because the government are clearly saying that actually some people's unemployment is different to other people's. So there's definitely still, maybe the government has kind of betrayed a way of seeing different types of workers. Because I'm like, well, you're unemployed or you're not, why should someone get more and someone get less? And, a lot of the conversation came up with the PUP payment in the beginning. They were saying, right, so are you saying that €200 a week is not enough to live on, when so many people live off that?
Yeah.
Like, if you're disabled, that's what you live off. So why is it that if you had a better job, you can't live off that? I don't know. I think they revealed something about themselves anyway by doing it that way.
For sure, actually, yeah. It's a very. Before I really want to get into this, I think it would be nice for everyone to just get a greater background on you yourself, and your recent history and how you've come to be where you are now. Yeah, could you tell us a bit about yourself, please?
Yeah, which is usually the most difficult thing to do, isn't it?
Yes.
So my name is Saoirse McHugh. I'm from Achill Island, and I am a lifetime environmentalist, I'll say. And over the last few years, I have been, trying to engage with the political system. I suppose it only counts as lobbying if you get paid, but I was doing unpaid lobbying for, different legislative changes, different changes to the constitution. Now, I didn't get very far with that at all. I think maybe I was a bit youthfully naive. I've been involved with a lot of growers' organisation with food sovereignty and organic growing in Ireland, and I suppose I've worked a lot on agricultural reform. I had a brief stint in the Green Party where I ran for a European election, a general election, and I think I tried to get into the Shannon 3 times in the space of like 12 months. And I didn't get elected, and I stayed in the party and ended up leaving after the party accepted a programme for government to get in with the current government. So now I suppose, after having dedicated my life for the last year and a half or 2 years trying to get elected, I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do next, and how I can best be effective, I suppose. Which, if you have any insight, I'd love to hear it.
I frequently tell myself I know nothing, so I can't tell anybody else. I can't give any advice. And I really do want to get into the departure from the Green Party. But before, I'd love to know, how did you first begin your environmental work? Or how did it all start for you?
Well, I suppose on one hand, I'd always felt it. So it was quite natural. I always kind of felt compelled to do something, whatever that was. And this ranges from really misguided attempts when I was younger to buy an acre of rainforest. Do you remember those kind of gimmicks?
Yeah.
But the sentiment, I now maybe I'm a bit more knowledgeable about what can actually help and what can't. But the sentiment was always there, and I suppose this really started when I was about 21, and I ended up working with different groups that were trying to preserve native landrace seeds. So it was they were trying to preserve different types of maize and different, native squashes, and just they introduced me to the concept of food sovereignty, and it was from there. It was like a match was lit. So I should have said I was in Mexico at the time, and I remember I distinctly remember a conversation where someone was describing to me. Now, this was in my really, really poor Spanish, and they're completely fluent Spanish. Was describing to me how NAFTA had really kind of fragmented the countryside and the economy of Mexico, because it allowed really cheap subsidized corn be dumped into the Mexican economy from the US. And I remember trying to wrap my head around how this had an effect. Like how did a free trade agreement mean that different varieties of corn were becoming extinct? And then I suppose once I grasped that, you start to see how trade, and especially how the control of your food, can affect entire populations, and it affects the shape of the landscapes and the quality of the landscapes. And after that, I came back to England, and I decided to do a master's in sustainable agriculture and food security. And it was from there I was always trying to figure out, once again, how could I make any sort of difference. And there was a lot, and sure there still is, of failed projects. So I remember at one stage putting together a presentation on food sovereignty, and going to a few different schools, presenting it to transition year students. And they're just, I definitely could have done with a bit of maybe help or feedback, because I kind of lost heart in that, because it just, I suppose I didn't have a clear idea of what I wanted from the students. In my head, I was like, oh, once they know these things, they'll be outraged, and they'll rise up or something. I didn't really know, and I spent my time trying to write different articles, trying to revive Food Sovereignty Ireland, which it did actually kind of roll back into life, and Talamh Beo was then set up, which I can't take any credit for whatsoever, but this is the Irish branch of the International Peasants Movement, which, are campaigning for food sovereignty. Now, it's a difficult one, because I don't think Irish farmers identify as peasants. So we kind of avoid that language bit. But
yeah,
I was always just trying different things. And for instance, how I ended up in politics was advocating and trying to organize a conference around the rights of nature, and what that would look like if it was brought into the Irish Constitution. Like, could it even be brought into the Irish Constitution? And like, once again, perhaps I was a tad misguided in that, I look at a lot of the environmental laws we have now. You don't even have to go to the Constitution, but the laws we have now, and a lot of the issue is enforcement rather than the law not being there, which wouldn't necessarily change at all if there was a rights to nature bill in the Constitution. Like, I do think, as I think about it now, I think we're quite far away from that. But still, I kept knocking on doors, mainly talking about food sovereignty, trying to volunteer with different politicians to help integrate food sovereignty policy, or to help, I suppose, move agricultural policy to a place where food sovereignty could take off. Because I don't think you can legislate really for food sovereignty. I don't think it would. I think it has to be something bottom up, or else it's not food sovereignty.
Yeah.
And so I suppose how I ended up in environmentalism is just, it always felt right, and I still feel like I'm kind of finding my feet in terms of what works, what doesn't, what's effective and what's not. Because I also have this kind of this feeling inside me all the time, and it is it's lessening, but this feeling is quick, we have to hurry, which means, like, the idea of working on something for 20 years, I'm like, oh God, I don't have time.
Yeah.
But I'm starting to think that maybe actually that's what you have to do.
Yeah, it's because, sorry, what comes to mind is when you were mentioning you presenting to the transition year kids, and them not having the reaction that you expected or that you hoped for. I was wondering, has that been difficult for you also in the political aspect, in the political realm, where people know a lot of this information, or some of this information that you are you feel very strongly about and you want to act upon, but has it been difficult for you to see that there's this kind of lethargy among quite a strong amount of the population where, hey, it's not that bad for me, or it's for the people who it isn't that bad for, yeah, I care, but not enough to kind of jilt this kind of fineness in my life?
Yeah, and I suppose it's awful to watch, or it's awful to see, but it's really understandable. And it kind of, part of me thinks, like, of course people feel like that. Like, I think, you look at coronavirus and the response that people had to it, and how everyone was willing to completely alter their lives. And, coronavirus is a minor blip compared to what climate breakdown is bringing. But yet it is, it has a couple of key elements in that nobody was making money from coronavirus. It was very immediate. So people are saying like, this is circulating in your community. You do not want to get a disease and die. And it was very simple. Whereas with climate breakdown, it's very complicated and very messy, and probably so much worse than it is projected to be. But also, like, our entire economy and society is built around exacerbating climate breakdown. It's not built around that, but its entire structure leads to that. And thirdly, it's on such a slow time scale, not geologically, but in terms of humanity.
Yeah.
That it's kind of hard to, it's hard to rally that urgency in people, because you do, like I do it myself. You think that, or you feel that surely if this was this urgent, our governments would do something about it. Like, because imagine if the governments hadn't really said anything about coronavirus and we're like, oh yeah, it's fine. Everyone would start thinking that it's fine because we internalize these social cues.
Yeah.
It's like how kids learn to not be afraid of certain things. They watch the adults. And if the adults aren't afraid, that, they learn that. And they're like, okay, this is actually fine. And we're all learning, I think, we're all looking around and we're like, oh, everything else seems to be fine. So it must be fine, right?
Yeah.
What?
It's interesting though, because like you say, it is quite a long stretch geologically, but even still, we're like reminded of these particularly huge events. Like if you just look at the wildfires at the minute in the States, like these are huge events that are happening right now, and that there's a direct correlation between how our economy is being run, and still there doesn't seem to be like this direct movement towards action.
No, no, there's not. And like that, I think, a lot of shutting down the economies because of coronavirus, I think is about protecting human life. But in the end, it was also like, geez, our economies won't take mass, illness and a really high death toll. And like that, nobody was making money from coronavirus happening. But with the wildfires, I think there's just, there's one or two levels of abstraction, because you can say, well, there's always been fires, there's always been wildfires. And that's what, like, you hear it all the time in the news and the weather. They'll say like these once in a lifetime flood, or once every 100-year storm, and you're like, yeah, but didn't this happen in 2004 and 2011? But they still use this language. So it's definitely immediate and it's happening all around us, but it's still happening slowly. It's not like a meteor or something all at once. It's happening in a way that we normalize it every time it happens. Like there was wildfires in the Arctic last year, and there's wildfires in the Arctic this year. And all of a sudden we're like, wow, there's just going to be wildfires in the Arctic every year, and we're all going to be like, oh, yeah, apparently there used to be in the past.
Yeah. It's just, it's all very surreal. And I wonder what would you say to people, because I know you've been quite critical after leaving the Green Party of the electoral system, and I wonder what would you say to people that do feel a bit kind of like they care, but they also, for instance, one of my friends who cares very strongly about the environment was telling me during the week that he's like, I'm sick to death of people telling me that I should join the Green Party. Like there has to be something else also. There has to be a more profound next step. And I was wondering, what's your thoughts on this possible next step?
Well, I think, like, as in if you were to get active but didn't want to join the Greens.
Yeah.
Well, at first I'm going to say I don't think joining the Greens helps at all. In fact, I think it does damage to environmentalism. And secondly, like, I think, you know, our electoral system is weighted towards conservatives because you're trying to offend the least amount of people to get elected. So you're constantly trying to present and appeal to the most amount of people. So, you know, it's probably good in a way that it means that like the far right don't get an electoral foothold. But it also means that our politicians tend to be behind the population in terms of, I think our population is just more progressive than our politicians because they're constantly trying to make sure they get elected next time, you know. And in terms of the next step, you see, I'm not fully sure. Like, I don't think it's going to come from politicians. And myself and a friend were just talking about this a few days ago. Like, what do you do? Do you just create the alternative? I can't remember what a theorist used to talk or talks about. Like, if you just create your alternative, then whatever, the state as you know it withers away, or, you know, the systems that you no longer use wither away. Or is it about education? Is it about trying to get as many people as possible to force the change from our government? I'm not really sure. Like, and I think I'm the biggest culprit of this of all. But I get so, like, I know talking about it isn't it. You know, I know that's not the change.
Yeah.
Like, I know it plays a role in that things have to be spoken about, but the action to be taken at the moment, and like that, I'm never going to pretend I might not agree with myself in 2 months' time, but at the moment, what I think needs doing is the alternative needs to begin to be created. Like, we have to just start acting like we're the grown-ups, like we're the people in charge here. And similarly, I think, you know, things just have to be done. Like, I'm all about protest, you know, symbolic protest. And I think it does play a role, and it plays a great role in terms of raising awareness. But at what stage do we just have to say, right, we're actually just going to stop this being built? Or we're literally just going to not, you know, allow those planes to take off? Or we're not, you know, or we're just actually not going to allow, you know, the dairy herd expand. Like, and that's what I'm tending to at the moment now. You know, I haven't done any of these things myself, because it is really difficult, and the temptation is really strong to just, you know, to hope someone comes up with the answer.
Yeah.
But I can't see anything. I can't see a way forward currently except for creating these alternatives we keep talking about.
Do you think part of it is maybe reconsidering what we are personally willing to lose, or reevaluating what we are personally willing to lose for an actual collective change or a collective momentum to possibly reach the change? You know, like you said with the long termness, I think maybe like me as well as what I think for other people, how it's hard for you to say, yeah, I'll justify me maybe, like, for instance, possibly losing my job, or like possibly losing this for the possibility of something then changing in the near future. You know, I feel like it's very hard for us to commit to something. Like, it's really, I was just thinking about it for the last few months, really. It's like the ultimate act of faith where you're saying, no, this is what I care about, and I'm going to put in whatever I can for the possibility of this to change. You know, like the people who've been fighting for civil rights, like they don't do it with this like caveat guarantee that, you know, in 6.5 years this will work out, or in 7.5 years, or 20 years. They're just doing it because they care so much about this that they're willing to put it in. And then if nothing comes of it, this is what they had to do anyway, you know?
Yeah, well, I suppose the beauty of climate change is, and climate breakdown is that things are going to change.
Yeah.
So it's no longer it's not a question of, you know, an act of faith in the hopes that things will change for the better. It's, will I make these changes now, or do I risk the very worst? You know, because climate breakdown is happening. And so one way or another, things are going to change. It's how bad are we willing to let it get? You know, and I suppose I'd be wary of going down the how much can one person do route.
Yeah.
Because, you know, the individual action will only get us that far. But saying that, you know, also we have to bear in mind that this system change that we talk about will come with changes for us all, and in this part of the world, reductions in what we consider now to be quality of life. So I'm not going to go around saying to people, you've to eat less animal products and you've to fly less. But I will say that if we manage to, you know, get this system changed that we want, you will be taking less flights and you will be eating less animal products. You know, as a consequence of that. But that being said, you know, even framing it in that way is, I don't know, it's so beside the point, I think, because what you're gaining is like a livable future and water, and not, you know, massive wildfires and maybe some like whales and dolphins left in your children's future.
Yeah. I have a few questions in my head. The one that comes to mind is, I know you're also quite critical of the economically or finance driven push towards environmental or less environmentally harmful policy or behavior. You know, saying, oh, we can only allow X amount of carbon emissions, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know if you're familiar with Charles Eisenstein.
No.
So he's an American writer who was saying that similar to this rhetoric, that he says we're looking at this completely wrong. We can't look at oh yeah, it's fine that we burnt down this forest. We're just going to plant more trees in another place. He says that, or we can't just look at saying we can only have this amount of fossil fuel or carbon emissions, et cetera, et cetera. He's saying that until we start looking at these forests or the environment as like part of us, which it is, then the numbers game can only get us so far. But the thing is, like, when I say this, like a lot of people I think that's it's just a little too hippie sounding ish to possibly look at a tree like it is part of me. You know, it's clearly not part of me. And I guess I wanted to know, because I know you're critical of the finance driven approach, or the number driven approach, but it is so hard. Like, that's why I think it's key to try and get a shift of consciousness amongst the population. But I was wondering, how do you think this can be? Like, how do you think we could get this? You know, how do you think we could find reach a place where people are looking at trees and animals like they are part of us? You know, because they are, like, they're essential to our well-being.
Well, I wonder. So I don't know how we could get there, but I do wonder. Like, I wonder what it'd be like to talk to people in, you know, California or Oregon over the next few weeks and months, and talk to people who, you know, weren't into nature at all, and to see, has there been any sense of loss or grief over what has happened over there? Because it would be shocking if there hadn't been. But like that, you know, there might not have been. I suppose in terms of trying to talk to people about this, about the numbers approach versus the more holistic kind of, you know, we are part of one big life. I think people can understand that if we go down the numbers approach, we leave ourselves open to a situation like have you ever seen Elysium? It's
No,
a
sorry.
it's a film anyway. I can't even remember who's in it, but people live down on Earth. I think there's aliens there as well, or maybe I'm mixing up two. But basically, all the rich people live in like this constructed ecosphere up in the sky that's beautiful and everything, and Earth is just like destroyed, the barren wasteland. And if we go down the numbers approach, first of all, we start to fudge the reality of what we're talking about. Like if you talk about tons of carbon, but you're not talking about entire ecosystems, then you're really only taking one tiny metric of that ecosystem's value. And I think it does appeal to a lot of people when you say, instead of focusing on how do we get to net zero, we need to focus on what kind of society we want at net zero. Because, you know, a lot of people, if we do just continue focusing on numbers, a lot of people will be left behind. And I am of the firm belief that if we continue down that route, there won't be public support for it. Because I think it's a tendency of the economic system we have now to use people's lives kind of disposably. So I think people won't support environmental measures. And then what I think we'll end up going to is like either an awful eco-fascist kind of future, or some sort of not eco-fascist future, but just fascist future, perhaps. And I do think that unless people are worked into these equations and feel as valued as every ton of carbon, then you're never going to get those same people to think, okay, well, if there's space for me here, there's space for trees and animals and rivers. Like it's very hard to get a population that isn't cared about to care about trees. Yeah. And I think only by saying to a person, look, you have a home, you have education, you have healthcare, the world is good, you can know that you can flee this home and you won't be met by violent border security. Wouldn't you like, what about nature? What about the wild? And I think if people themselves feel cared for, I think they'll be able to care. I'm not like that. I'm not sure. I'm just kind of spitballing here.
No, that's really interesting, because I was going to ask you something similar on this, that I was going to ask you the deeper reasons behind this lethargy among policymakers, or like the tone deaf policies that we're seeing lately, and the population that don't really express kind of outrage at this environmentally harmful behavior. And if anyone listens to the podcast, they know I love this guy called Gabor Mate, and one of my favorite kind of talks he has is, he says that the problems, many of the societal problems that we have now, stem from us not being connected to ourselves, not being connected to the people around us, and not being connected to the environment. And it's interesting you say that perhaps you think a lot of the people who are not caring about the environment don't feel cared for themselves.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think if you feel you have to fight for, a quality of life, if you have to fight for housing, fight for jobs, fight for your kids' education, it feels so far from you. Vast tracts of wildlife being burnt up in flames. It just feels like I do not have time to think about that. Or yes, I would like to think about that if I didn't have, 100 other day-to-day things on my mind. And I think that's been a great trick of our economic system, is to alienate people so much. Initially, from their work, from the land, and from the environment. I often think back to I remember reading a book that was quoting a British a British article, I think, at the time, like back during the 1600s, during the enclosures in England, and what he was talking about was how it was done. It was made intentional that the hedgerows on the land did not provide sustenance for the people being kicked off the land. So, like, it was a very, very intentional move to sever the immediate relationship with the land from people in order to force them into wage work in the cities and towns. Um,
Wow.
Now, it might not be a direct kind of ideological relation, but I've always found that story to be really. It shows really clearly what our problem is, which is this this massive just disenfranchisement of people from increasing aspects of their life. So, like in Ireland, we can look at housing in this generation compared to housing, 50, 60 years ago. And most people are like, oh, yes, I will never own a home. Marvelous.
Yeah.
What do we do then? And I think the coronavirus has really shown that Dublin is just not made for people. Like, we've had an entire city that has been taken away from the people that live in it.
Yeah.
And I do think that's all related or come from the same kind of ideological family as what we've done to people with nature, and how a lot of people interact with nature solely now as this kind of thing to go visit in the countryside. You go look at it, and even then it's, these overgrazed hills. I've totally rambled off the point there.
No, it's interesting that, and I guess I wanted to ask then, do you think that the politicians are also victims of this disconnection?
Yeah.
Like,
Go on.
and I wonder, is the approach? I know it's very hard to for many people to look at it this way, but I wonder, would the approach to be to look at Varadkar and whoever and say, okay, they are clearly disconnected from the people in their city, or you cannot allow this policy to be made, or you cannot have this statement if there not is an obvious disconnection between you and the people, or you and yourself even.
Well, I'm going to be a bit more cynical about some of our politicians and say that I don't think they're disconnected. I just think they're ideologically committed to this kind of, I can't believe it's still going on, this kind of neoliberal, this like, neo-Thatcherite sort of economic system. Like, I don't think it's a disconnect. I think it's an intentional decision. And there's very few people in the world, like very, very few people in the world who benefit from that sort of ideology. But there's a lot of people who benefit from facilitating it. And I think a lot of our politicians fall into that fall into that category. Because and perhaps you can only fall into that category if you are already disconnected from nature and from the environment and from the people in your community. So perhaps the disconnection is like an underlying condition needed for a commitment.
A prerequisite.
Yeah, because it wouldn't happen otherwise. You'd be like, God, no, that's awful. Why would I do that to everyone? Why would I do that to the world?
That's what I can't stop thinking about. But then I have to ask you, during your time at the Green Party, I presume that there are many people in the Green Party that also definitely have this connection and are definitely upset at seeing these disconnections. But it's strange. Like, it's like somewhere along the way, I'm just interested, like, how how does the process happen? Like how far do you have to rise for it to say, okay, sorry, now I'm cut off from the people and I just have to do these things to adhere to an ideology that I don't really need to question. And as long as I'm fine and as long as I get reelected, that's okay.
Geez, from what I've seen, you don't have to be in it very long or very, you don't have to be up very high in it. I think that the whole structure itself, kind of once you're in it, you just buy into the idea that this is how things get done, and especially in the Greens, there's this almost pathological kind of idea that compromise is a good in and of itself. So perhaps there hasn't been a buy-in to neoliberalism, but in the Greens anyway, there's this idea that if you compromise, that means you're good, and even the worst compromise is better than a flat out rejection or objection, which isn't true. Sometimes compromise is the wrong thing to do. Yeah. Especially if the compromise is between, right and wrong. And so within the Greens, I don't know where it comes from, but also I think then being in government, from what I've seen, you instantly become defensive because you are trying your best, and even though you're wrong and misguided, I think you start to feel like, well, hey, I am trying. At least I'm trying something, and so the dissent and the conversation that's maybe more welcome when a party is in opposition, very quickly becomes something that the party as a structure, as a kind of a social entity, whether it ever admits it or not, but tries to drive out.
I see. Did you feel hurt personally after the Green Party's actions after getting elected? Did you feel personally let down, and then leaving wasn't a difficult decision at all?
Yeah, it was. Well, I couldn't believe they signed up to that program for government. It was such a poor. It is such a poor document, and people within the party kept trying to say like, oh, but we'll be around the table. And I'm like, yeah, but the table has already been outlined by the program for government.
Yeah.
You've already seen the menu.
Yeah.
You're never going to get anything more. It's not like you're going to get this. It's not like you're going to pull some sort of rabbit out of the program for government. It is what it is. And I was really hurt during the whole program for government negotiations, because it turned out that a lot of the positive things that the Green Party promote, that the policy is member driven, that the parliamentary party have very little powers, that the exec have most of the powers and they're elected by the members. Like it is quite a democratic party structure. But what became very clear during the program for government was that the parliamentary party did not actually care. They didn't care about policies. They didn't care about who was allowed, whether it was right that they would try and suspend somebody unilaterally. They just showed time and time again that they did not care about the policies on which the party was supposed to be based, because it just didn't suit them and they wanted to get into government. So I was really hurt by that. And then when they voted for the program for government, I was like, okay, wow, I'm actually obviously in the wrong place altogether. I was shocked. Like, they passed it with a higher majority than either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Would you be mortified?
God.
So leaving was such a relief, to be honest.
Okay, so let me ask you, I don't want to ask it, but I want to ask you. Let me ask you, best case scenario, how you see the next few years rolling out. And then I want to ask, worst case scenario, how you see the next few years rolling out. Like, do you think that that the Green Party will actually agreeing to the paper, the document, and joining government? Do you think that this will do long-term damage to the Green Party's appeal? And
okay, so best case scenario,
yeah,
I see a group of good Greens split from the main party, and I don't know, form their own or whatever. But I think what would be really important would be to have somebody and a group out advocating strongly that these policies are not environmental. This is not environmentalism. Environmentalism is for everybody. And then, okay, so actually, no, sorry, I'm not being imaginative enough. Best case scenario.
Okay.
The government folds in a year, and no one from Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, or the Greens gets elected again. But the good Greens have already split. There's a huge left bloc government, and they swoop in and they introduce a massive stimulus program, which is like got real Green New Deal vibes, whereby we're both, securing the I suppose the social safety net, while doing the things that really, really require a state to do, like, transforming our electricity generation, building social housing, or seizing houses from all over the country, from developers, from NAMA, from everyone, just taking the houses and giving them to people, and maybe pulling Ireland out. I'd be wary of saying pulling out of the EU because of how badly Brexit has gone, and because how open it is to kind of racist organising. But the EU is really damaging in terms of its military, in terms of its trade policies, in terms of its agricultural policies. But anyway, yeah. So then over between 2 and 4 years, they do all the big statist kind of things that need doing, and then the people decide enough. We don't want to be governed anymore, and communities just begin to organise, and communities take over the housing, take over feeding themselves, educating themselves, take over the healthcare, and eventually the state just kind of withers away, and we just live happily ever after.
And it's just very, very local governance.
Yeah. And obviously all across the world, similar things would have been happening, and in those 2 or 3 years where the state was really doing big statey kind of things, there's huge rewilding programs. There was a massive, rollback of fishing fleets and of really damaging ecological practices. It'd be great. And then worst case scenario. Worst case scenario is this continues for the next 4 or 5 years. The Fine Gael, you see, I'd say Fine Gael and Sinn Féin are looking at Fianna Fáil and the Greens and looking to just carve them up, to be honest, between them. Everyone's put off the idea of environmentalism. Sinn Féin don't want to approach environmentalism because, they've spent the last 5 years bashing the Greens. They know those ideas, environmentalism is linked to the Greens. So then we end up with a Sinn Féin, Fine Gael, I don't know who's in power or who's not, but regardless, we have, sea levels rising every single year, massive droughts. We continue the way we are going ecologically in terms of total biodiversity wipeout on this island. And eventually in 40 or 50 years' time, when the place is almost uninhabitable and we all have to paddle around in canoes because the tide has raised so high, We think, Jesus, maybe we should have had some green policies in. I don't know. We're all like, driving around in ragged leather bralettes and in a kind of Mad Max future. That's the worst case scenario.
Well, I do admire your optimism your optimism in terms of the best case scenario, because I also feel a similar way in the need for there just to be more local voices being heard, and for things to be sorted out on more communal levels. And I do think, like what you said earlier, that if people have the opportunity to be heard and have the opportunity to have a home and feel like they're connected to the people and their local parks, that they were going to be like it. I just think it's an obvious consequence to then push for more environmentally friendly behaviors across the board.
Yeah, definitely.
Before you leave, I would love to just ask you about rent, just the renting situation here, and whether you think that, okay, assuming that this best case scenario doesn't happen, I'm wondering, do you think that that living arrangements will like change substantially within our generation and future generation in the coming years and decades, just because of the like how unaffordable it is? And
like I think, to be honest, I think if our generation, I assume you're similar age to me, are you?
I'm sorry, I'm from Dublin.
No, but a similar age.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm 26.
Okay, well, you're a bit younger than me. To be honest now, if our generation went our whole lives without saying enough, we're not going to fucking do this, then then what are we at? I can't imagine it going on. I can't imagine it not changing within our lifetime, because like, if you look at it, okay, so what's the future? So eventually we just all live in houses owned by IRES RET or whatever they're called. Like, that's nonsense. Or we all live in our parents' houses until like what, and hope we get the house in the will. I think they'll have to change, because like every single week the housing situation is getting worse and worse and worse. Like, my brother was just told today by his landlord, like I think his landlord didn't even realize what he was saying, but he was telling my brother that he wasn't going to let an American girl move into the house. And I quote, because, if I want to kick you out, she has nowhere to go. At least you can go back to your mom and dad's house. She'll have nowhere to live, and she might not leave. And my brother was like, oh, gee, thanks. Cool. So, like, I've been let stay in your house because you can kick me out easily without feeling guilty. Great. And I just don't think people will put up with it. It's completely unsustainable. And I wonder, have the businesses in Dublin, have they looked around during the pandemic and been like, oh, shite, actually nobody lives in Dublin. Like, and now we're like, oh, please come in and shop here. If you're not paying extortionate rent and being made come into work in an office, the entire centre of Dublin is just empty.
Yeah.
So I do think it will change. I think these things always get to a point, and then it just breaks. Which is why I always think, like, what are the landlords at? Like, where do they think this is going to end up? Like, what's their plan? They're not even saying, like, trying to be nice, cozy, friendly capitalism, where they say, oh, of course you can have a house. They're like, no, we want more. Until people like will literally have nothing to lose. Like, people just don't have places to live anymore. So I definitely think it will change. Definitely.
I really hope so. Yeah, I sincerely hope so. Just because otherwise, I was just talking to my sister today, and we're both talking about kind of emigrating for the next few years, possibly just because it's the only possibility for us to move out, to live separately, or to live alone.
Yeah.
and
Where'd you
it's
go?
just
Somewhere nice.
oh well, my girlfriend lives in Italy, so that would be the first port of call for me. But and it's just as much as moving to Italy sounds nice. It's just it would be great if I felt so welcomed here that I just didn't want to, and I'm sure that's a lot of I'm sure that's how many people feel that are in Australia and Canada.
Yeah.
If they didn't feel like this was just the best option to leave, they wouldn't.
Yeah. I was just listening to a podcast yesterday
Uh-huh.
um, called Policed, and it was interviewing a intersex sex worker.
Uh-huh.
I think her name was Adeline Barry, but um, they were saying that Ireland, it presents itself as the Ireland of 100,000 welcomes, but like they grew up in Tala, and they said
Uh-huh.
they never felt welcome, and they emigrated to America, and they did come back, however 20 something years after emigrating, and still they were like, I don't, who is this welcome for? What do you like? Where is
Yeah.
this welcome? And I think many, a load of different sections of society kind of feel that they're like, what is this welcome? Where is it?
This is it. There's definitely several conditions before you get this welcome.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Just my final question I want to ask before we go, and it's what I particularly care about for you because when you care so much about this, I'm sure you've like me and like a few of my friends also really care about this. Like they just have dark days and dark weeks because it's very hard to stay optimistic, or it's hard to keep faith when it's just an onslaught of bad news and bad policy. And I basically want to know how you keep a solid sense of well-being throughout this difficult time.
Um, well, I don't keep, yeah, I wouldn't call my sense of well-being very solid.
Okay.
Um, I do. Oh yeah, I have awful days and weeks, and like when I'm lying in bed at night going to sleep, like I can feel these thoughts, like tend to be like, oh hey, seriously, you haven't thought about this in a while. And I'm like, and I'm trying to fall asleep before this takes over, and then I'm just lying awake thinking about this, feeling awful. Um,
Yeah.
so
No.
I try and not talk about negative things before bed.
Okay.
Um, and I suppose I just kind of accept that these waves come over me and pass. I have had to mute a load of words on the internet, words like ice and fire, um,
Really? Yeah.
because I just I've stopped reading a lot of reports on climate breakdown. I've started to be like, okay, look, right now I know that
Yeah.
things
Yeah. Yeah.
have to be done. I don't need to know the specifics. I'm going to guess what your report says is it's worse than we thought.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
But I'm not going to read it. And, I've wondered, is this kind of some sort of denialism? But I don't think it is because I know that things are really, really bad.
It's
I,
just finding out exactly how bad isn't probably the most productive
no,
way,
it's
or
not
yeah.
helpful. No. But other than that, I suppose I always go to the gym as much as I can. Um, and I do a good bit of gardening, a good bit of growing my own veg. Um, and I do try and read. So I've also so like I don't read. I will only let myself read fiction at night, going to bed. I won't let myself read anything that is non-fiction
Too
because
real.
non-fiction is awful. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I'm actually probably the worst person in the world to ask about uh, well-being for stuff like that because I find it so hard. Like I look at people. There's one fella in particular I follow on Instagram. I've met him a few times. Like he's married to a girl from home, but like I think he teaches CrossFit and they live in like San Diego or something, and they don't worry about climate change or climate breakdown or anything like that. They just have this like blissful life, or it looks blissful, and I'm like, oh my god, imagine being so unaware. Like I'm so envious of of people who don't have that cold knot in their stomach every day over this.
That's interesting you say that, because yeah, sometimes I think it as well. Sometimes I think, wouldn't it just be easier to just it's fine. But I think we'd just be lying to ourselves, you know. And I think while this is just me personally, I think while it's never going to be easy, and it's definitely taken like the harder road, there's kind of like something more true about it. Like at least you're being true to yourself. And not that this CrossFit guy isn't being true. Like maybe he is he's just lucky enough to have not had a timeline or something that shows him all this bad news.
Oh no, I think
like,
he's being totally genuine to himself.
Yeah. And I'm sure there are millions of other people like that as well. It's just when you know, you can't unknow.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, you know, we could probably go to somewhere and set up a bar and just go, yeah, life is great, but deep down we'd say, no, but we still know what's going on.
Yeah.
You know,
could you ever truly forget? What I'd like is some sort of like magic potion that I could actually just forget and live out my life, blissfully unaware of why everything awful is happening.
Oh, don't say that. Don't say that. No, you have. I guess. I don't know. Yeah, no. I mean, I think it's like what you said. Like know, but also know what you can do. Like know the limitations, and know it's like not your personal fault. You know, like it's. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, just do your best, I suppose, and mind yourself as best you can.
That's it. That's all we can do.
Yeah.
Listen, Saoirse, I really appreciate you giving us your time.
Well, thanks a million. Thanks for having me. It's very enjoyable.
Yes, thanks a million. Be in touch. All the best.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.